Wartales is a game that has a mixed past for me, mainly due to its path through early access, which originally left me fairly unimpressed over a year ago. Though, in the end, I think it has become a better game overall due to this journey, and there's a lot of things I like about this low fantasy game of tactics and hard choices. Especially now that you can adjust the difficulty and even the playstyle to fit more what you're looking for in it. That said, there are still a few things on my wish list, but none of them are real deal breakers for me if they stay missing. Though with how many layers the game already has, adding more would probably make this an even longer video, so maybe it is for the better. Now, as far as when you jump into the game, the first thing you'll go through is what is a fairly familiar choose your fate style selection system. On the first screen, you choose where your party is from, which determines your starting classes and some minor temporary bonuses and penalties that you'll get past fairly quickly. On the second screen, you get to select your party's strength, with a variety of bonuses that will last you the entire campaign. And finally, on the third screen, you choose your party's weakness, which again is a decent variety of options that will hinder you the entire campaign, though none of them are insurmountable, and it mostly just adds flavor. This is because as you progress, you'll be able to counter these penalties. I think the only thing I would consider improving here would be possibly a custom origin, or at the very least a custom class selection as one of the options, since I could see all ranger or all warrior, etc. runs being a fairly fun journey, possibly even letting you choose non-core classes for an even more difficult version of a challenge run. But that aside, after that, at least on your first playthrough, you'll have one starting area you can choose from, and you'll also be able to set your starting difficulties, though you can adjust some of these on the fly later on should you find the game too hard or too easy. And you'll also get to choose whether you want a dynamically adjusting world that adapts to its difficulty in your growing army, or if you want to have regions with predetermined difficulty so you can have an easy time should you go back to earlier areas and want to experience the story in kind of an even pacing, but also deal with punishments if you try to rush ahead with an inexperienced party. Personally, I prefer the region locked mode since it adds a bit more of a feeling of permanence, and it also gives you more options for dealing with more difficult encounters, since sometimes it will just be more fun to wait until later to deal with that particularly deadly situation, rather than to have it continually scaling along with you, which has a tendency to place up difficulty walls if you haven't built your party just right. Now, if you had already been through a good chunk of the game, you actually have a slightly different starting selection, since it lets you start in any one of the more basic regions. Or simply put, the regions where you'll be dealing with local politics and more normal foes like bandits, plague rats, and basic animals. As of the writing of this, you cannot start in the more advanced zones, but that's probably for the best, since I'm not sure a level 1 party wants to be fighting swarms of deadly mosquitoes, zombies, and endgame armies, especially since even the rat infestations can be challenging enough starting out. When you get into the game, regardless of where you decided to start, you'll get moving through the politics and story of the region, which, while there is an overarching story, the regional stories often felt a lot more fleshed out and palpable, to the point where I could see each region being able to stand on its own as an experience just in general if they flesh out the conclusions a bit more. Heck, they could even be their own game. If you wanted to 100% a region, you'd generally be spending a solid 15 to 30 hours in it on your first playthrough, unless you nab up a guide to rush through it. And that goes for every region in the game, with some pushing a little bit longer while others sitting slightly shorter, but that's just on average. Now, on the first playthrough, the region you start in establishes a fairly basic tone. There's a war going on in the world, there's refugees flooding this neutral province, tensions are high as the locals are resistant to the influx of new people looking to escape the war, there's some spikes in crimes as people struggle to survive, and patrolling troops to keep the peace amidst all this. As you proceed a little further and encounter some of these instances, you'll also encounter another major situation in the world, a plague, carried by rats that infest large nests in the world, and while optional, it does give you something more dire to face, and while you will get remedies for it later, early on it will be a struggle. Throughout the course of the first region, you will make decisions. Who you kill, who you support, and what paths you take will determine the final outcome of the region, and who has the power to make decisions. And on conclusion, you will get a pass to travel on to one of the neighboring regions. Or if you don't find the story engaging, you could just do a few jobs, get the money to pay for passage through the gates, and find one of the other regions and their new story. Either way, you will end up traveling to other counties. Whether it's to the west with an ongoing war, political and social issues, and your introduction to the church, or maybe to the east where you'll find wide-reaching vineyards and an unfortunate rot that seems to be destroying them, causing havoc for the regional economy and merchants. And as you complete these or buy passage further, you encounter more and more of these capsules of story that each can take up the length of a normal game, should you want to fully explore and exploit the regions. So if you're looking for a time-intensive world to dive into, then this game has no shortage of that. And with even more coming out in the 1.0 release, dumping hundreds of hours into this for 100% will not be far-fetched. For some, this may be a turnoff. I mean, I'm personally a proponent of games being 10 to 20 hours to get through the core content, since that respects your time. But thanks to some quality of life choices, this game can still be done in bite-sized chunks. Do a county this session, then pick it up later to do the next county whenever you have the itch, and you won't feel terribly lost, since the game includes plenty of ways to refresh you on the quests and jobs you've taken, as well as where you will want to go next. You won't be stepping in completely lost if you, say, take a month off from it to just kind of enjoy life away from the video game. That said, unless you want to be playing kind of the hard mode, the way the game scales almost mandates that to complete all the regions will require investing some time. Since unless you plan to at least complete a significant chunk of the regions as you progress through them, you will find yourself underpowered for the more advanced regions if you go with predetermined regional difficulties rather than scaling. This is true even on easy difficulty, since the further in you get, the slower the leveling, and you will be encountering things that will have required you to have gotten a decent amount of experience. Especially whenever you start encountering battles with a solid 10 to 15 enemies, not counting potential reinforcements. And for those of you with experience at tactics games, that 10 to 15 enemies may sound slightly intimidating. This is because seasoned veterans of the genre know that more bodies means much longer combat sequences, which is another reason I prefer predetermined difficulties, since I can always do some quick battles in easier zones to push myself a little bit over the edge if I need to, rather than solely wading into these much longer endgame battles. And yes, these will be longer battles, since having troops of 20 plus units yourself is not unheard of, especially if you go into the gotta collect 'em all mode, and this is doubly true if you're bringing animals into the fight. Though oddly, thanks to how the damage scaling and character durability goes, they still won't go into the ungodly length if you stay in level appropriate areas, since the ability to gang up on targets as well as attack animations being actually reasonable length, even for the execution animations that you can get from specific situations, does keep it in check a bit. Due to this, I actually found I ended up spending almost as much time positioning my units for battle in some late game encounters, but that was because I did end up packing over 25 units into a single battle just on my side, just because I could. Though, from what I can tell, a lot of players tend to stick to the more reasonable 10 to 15 units, which would be more than enough. Oddly, one thing that I really liked about the battles was the actual weather and environment was accounted for. If it's raining, you'll have to deal with mud patches slowing you down. If it's a thunderstorm, you'll have lightning too. If you're in the depths of a dungeon, better break out those torches on some characters, or the enemies will see you long before you see them. If it's foggy, guess what? Enemies might be obscured in it, meaning you'll take unnecessary damage unless you root them out. And adapting to this is super important, and keeping these options is actually where I ended up spending a decent chunk of my storage space, in addition to survival necessities like food, of course. Now you may be thinking, food in a tactical RPG? Yep. You have to maintain your army by camping and giving them food, and in the case of human characters that are not prisoners, you'll need to give them some gold to pay their wages too. This is the survival aspect of the game, and one that you can adjust when starting it. So if you want harder difficulties, you can set this to a higher challenge. If you want to forget about it for the most part, best go on the easier setting. Though I would not ignore it there either, since you can still lose your army if you go completely ham on not paying wages. These forced camping sessions also serve to build up the interpersonal relationships with your characters, either through events or interactions, which can give them traits, buffs, and debuffs. And you'll even see these pop up based on some actions in battle as well, though they did seem to become more common as I got further into the game, though it may have just been that I was able to move through progress at a much faster pace as I got more used to the game. Now, we've gotten this far in, talked about the story, talked about survival and top-level battle stuff, but we all know that in a tactical RPG, the two key factors for the actual gameplay loop of combat are going to be your skills and your items. Starting with the items, there is crafting, which means picking up raw materials or scrapping old or pillaged gear to generate resources. And to do this, crafting will require advancing a profession for your characters, which you can change, but it is still handy to pursue like a specific one for stats. For gear, you have blacksmith, which will be your core equipment like your armor, weapons, and shields. You have alchemist, which will be your bombs, oils, and related accessories. And then you have tinkerer, which will handle things like torches and certain accessories as well. So you will need to level these up, and maybe even be careful about sending certain characters into the front line so you can make the high level items, since you obviously don't want your master blacksmith getting killed by a random bear in the woods just because he has a big sword to chop that bear apart. Or in my case, it was a drunk bear in jail, but that's a whole different story. To get materials for this crafting, and also for eating, you also have more utility-driven professions, with stuff like the anglers getting fish, the miners mining ores, etc., with only a few professions not really filling into these core functions of improving your gear or survival, since things like scholars, bards, and thieves only have specific functionality, not this more kind of broad, useful functionality. But these 3 are obviously not 100% necessary for a basic playthrough, they just make some things easier. Now, the gear itself you make with these professions kind of varies depending on the slot. The weapon slot is just your daggers, swords, axes, etc. that your troops use that are limited by the character's class, and yes, you need a character with an axe to chop wood, though there is no lumberjack profession. And to augment these weapons, you use the alchemist to craft oils to apply to them, which do things such as providing strength buffs, damage reduction, burning, poison, etc. on each attack. For the armor slot, it instead uses what are called layers, though a more familiar term for most people would be item sockets. Basically, slots you can put small buffs into. In this game, these layers are also crafted by the blacksmith, with bronze layers providing small single bonuses, silver layers providing similar value but multiple bonuses, etc. Some classes can also use an offhand slot. Well, technically they all can, but some like the archer and spearman would need to lose their two-handed weapons to use it. And this is the slot for weapons like throwing axes, daggers, and sickles you make with the blacksmith, bombs that you make with the alchemist, or torches that you make with the tinkerer, or for your more frontline characters, shields to keep you armored up, which also are made at the blacksmith. Now, there are no helmet, boot, etc. slots, but you do get one slot for a belt accessory, which generally boosts your combat abilities, and one slot for your backpack accessory, which generally boosts your profession. On animals, this is slimmed down a lot, since they can just basically equip one accessory, which will generally either be a collar or saddlebags, with the only exception being horses, which can wear armor if you take a certain skill on their skill tree. Though it is important to remember, this also forces them into battle as an ally, rather than staying away from combat like a pack horse. The other aspect of the tactical side is skills. While there are some non-battle skills, especially on animals, with things like finding cheese with mole rats, fish with the bear, or increasing carry weight on horses and boars, most of your skill selection will actually be battle-related, with a mix of passive skills and active skills. Passive skills that you'll pick will generally always be ways of recovering valor points, so you can use more active skills, and sometimes perks to your damage if you meet specific conditions. While active skills will consume a number of valor points when used, but provide either buffs or even extra forms of attacks while in battle. In addition to your skill tree skills, you'll also get trainable skills. So just because you skip the ability to, say, cure poison on an ally at the beginning, doesn't mean you cannot get it later from certain encounters in the world. The other thing these normal classes get, and yes, I'm saying normal classes for a reason, is specialties. These give you access to different armor types, as well as usually a combat skill, and they are a really good way to specialize your character into a specific role, though some did feel a lot stronger than others in my playthrough, so your mileage may vary. Now, I said normal classes because in this game, you can actually capture prisoners from other factions. Bandits, guards, bombers, inquisitors, etc. And of course, animals. Though each requires a different item to do so. Though mainly it's ropes for most animals, while you need chains for humans and even more specific chains for ghosts. These all tend to have more limited skill trees than their normal class counterparts, but can still be fun to play with if you like a lot of variety. So don't be afraid to mess around with them if you want some challenges or interesting experiences. That said, you cannot capture things like merchants and civilians, so don't waste your time on non-combat type characters, even though it would be fun for the challenge to work on that in your plans. But needless to say, if you're willing to dig for it, there's actually quite a few interesting options for party composition, especially as you get further into the game. Another thing you can do with these captured folks, or more precisely the outlaws, is you can also turn them into jails to lower your wanted level, which acts like it sounds, basically turning local law enforcement against you, so reducing this, if you've gotten into some trouble, will save you time and money. And hey, at a handful of coins per head, you can also make enough money to pay your upcoming wages by turning these criminals in as well. Now, that basically encompasses all the encounters you'll have, except for one, champions. And these can be found both in the wild, usually as part of a harder job that you can get, or in arenas, where you'll fight them for your victory rewards. These are characters that are often as strong or stronger than multiple normal characters, and they have unique attack patterns that happen multiple times per combat round. So you'll want to be on your toes when fighting them, or they will drop your party like flies, even if you're overleveled. So always save and prepare ahead if you're going to take one on. Probably the last big thing to go over, at least in core functions, since we've already talked about story, dungeons, troops, and even crafting, and yes, dungeons have a bunch of puzzle things in them too, is troop progression. As you complete tasks, you'll get experience towards different playstyles, which will in turn give you points to improve your entire party. This experience can be gained from any number of things, with avoiding injuries giving you troop bonuses, throwing bombs giving you knowledge bonuses, picking locks giving you thieving bonuses, etc. These are all especially important to watch and do the tasks on, since they will also give you access to different camp tools for everything from reassembling damaged artifacts to being able to set battle strategies that give you in-battle perks. These additional camping options, while actually really good in and of themselves, also let you separate people who don't like each other, so they don't drag the rest of the party down with them, since the social aspect of your troops can be pretty important as well. Now, after all that, you'd think I was gushing about the game and say it's the best thing ever, so many layers, like a big cake, so many interesting things, and it doesn't even need to dip into using magic. Just a little supernatural flair with zombies and ghosts. And the grid of, well, more low fantasy settings with a plague. And on some levels, it really does earn that praise, but yes, there is a but. It is not without its flaws. For example, invisible walls are a thing. Well, they're visible, but in the form of an unclearable fog of war that you just simply cannot walk past. This can hamper world exploring for me, and hopefully is something they'll address with 1.0, but I'm not going to hold my breath on it. Though I would not be surprised to see mods that expand these areas to actual mountain ranges at least, with more content so you don't have those weird, awkward, just black walls you can't pass. This is not helped by the fact that sometimes the pathfinding is just, well, bad. I lost track of the number of times I found a tiny cliff in the woods, or I thought I could walk around something, but it turned out I couldn't, just because they sprinkled some near imperceptible gray areas on the map under some trees or other terrain. So I had to backtrack all the way around it, and this is not helped by some things being simply hard to click on, especially ropes for traversing up and down cliffs. That one particularly got me kind of annoyed. Now, are these things game-breaking? No, you get used to them and you go around them. But they are inconvenient, and they pull me out of the zone when I was on a marathon session and had gotten into a rhythm. And it's doubly confusing because in one section, I was at a loss of how to get to a temple to raid it, because I didn't realize these very clear and definite cliffs were actually traversable, while I oddly got stopped by pebbles on the ground before. Moving away from the world map, and ignoring the fact that it takes forever to set up my troops because I had way too damn many, another gripe I had is that in camp, something you'll be spending a lot of time in felt extremely cramped by the end, as if they ended up including more camp additions than they originally intended with the layout. So shuffling things around was pretty much necessary to get new objects to fit, much less fit with people attached to them, at least to use their functions. I sadly got to the point where I honestly would have preferred it almost entirely in a menu system, since despite how cool it looks, it did start to get inconvenient. Thankfully though, if you get ambushed while camping, it's just a normal wilderness fight. I can only imagine how claustrophobic it would have been if they had you fighting in the camp. My last gripe would probably be the one that felt worse in the beginning than the end, and that is how certain professions work. Namely, fishing, mining, chopping wood, lockpicking, and even playing music as a bard. Each of these break off into essentially a mini game of sorts, most of them being rhythm-based to an extent with the exception of lockpicking, and many of their mechanics are fairly poorly explained by the tutorials. The mining and wood chopping minigames are just align the ring in the circle and click when it's green. Timing based, but fine for the most part. Playing music as a bard is essentially a mouse-driven guitar hero, which I never really got the hang of. Lockpicking is a game of find the sweet spot, which took me a few tries to figure out, but then it was insanely easy after I figured it out. While fishing was just a frustrating game of keep the arrow in the middle, though it didn't explain how in the tutorial. So to save you some trouble, pressing the mouse button moves it to the right, releasing the mouse button moves it to the left. They just said keep it in the middle. You're not actually controlling the arrow beyond these two actions of clicking or not clicking. And if you play tactical games because of some limited abilities in your motor functions, some of these mini-games could very easily be out of your reach. And mining, wood chopping, and lockpicking were pretty important tools for my playthrough. Despite these gripes, I did still enjoy my time with the game. I played mostly on normal and easy, depending on how engaged I was at the time, though could see myself trying a hard mode run if I got really hooked into it. Though I doubt I'd want to do an Iron Man run since I think it would definitely become tedious, especially since the late game growth of characters slows down exponentially, so losing one at that point would be infuriating to say the least, especially since you can only have two characters fighting the training dummy at once for the rest experience, which is how you kind of accelerate characters to catch up. Generally, my recommendation would be to treat it like a game with a handful of short stories, assembled into just one larger one. Play through and 100% a region, then take a break, and come back for the next one later. This will curb the leveling burnout. It will get you a decent enough army for advancing, and give you plenty of tactical goodness in several hour bursts. I don't think playing it all the way through in one long go is the way to really enjoy it, since I did hit the burnout by the third region, though going back to it later felt a renewed vigor to deal with it. And while none of the systems are exceptionally deep, they do combine nicely and work with each other in a pleasing manner, making it a fairly solid game I can see myself returning to. Not only solo, but maybe with some friends, but we'll have to see on that.